Welcome to this 10th episode of Heydorn and Watson. It's episode 10 already. And today we're going to be talking about an aspect of social credit theory which is critically important and which actually differentiates social credit from all other economic models, theories that I'm aware of, both conventional or mainstream and alternative. And that is the social credit attitude towards employment, right? The economy, as things stand, the economy requires a certain amount of human labor in order for it to produce the goods and services that people need to survive and flourish. But thanks to technological advances that are, accelerating exponentially, the number of people that are required for any given production program has been steadily diminishing over the last decades, to the point where, a century ago, most people worked in agriculture. Now only 2% of the population work in agriculture. Yes, there have, certain new jobs have been created for new markets, whether those markets actually serve a legitimate human need or they are the effect of advertising and sort of bamboozling people into buying things that they wouldn't otherwise entertain. But we're rapidly approaching a situation which, thanks to automation, they're predicting, for example, that 50% of existing American jobs will be automated within 20 years. So this labor displacement that has been affected by the machine is now taking a new form, and the economy, the financial system, the economic model will have to adapt in some significant way, and otherwise we're going to have a supreme social crisis. And this is where social credit has something very important to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
And the basic message of social credit when it comes to employment is that we should only employ as many people as is necessary to produce the goods and services we need to survive and flourish. So if at a given level of technology, let's say our present level of technology, we really only require 20% of the available labor force to be working in paid employment in the formal economy in order to achieve that physical end of delivering the goods and services that we need, then only 20% of the population should be employed. We shouldn't insist on employing 30% of the population or 50% or 100% of the population. That would be completely inefficient. Now, under the existing economic model, we have a policy of full employment. That is to say, everyone between a certain age, let's say early adulthood and whatever the retirement age is in the given jurisdiction, 65, let's say, is expected to work either for themselves by operating their own business or to work for someone else as an employee. And unless of course they've got some very serious illness that prevents them from working, or they're a student, or a stay-at-home mother or something like that. But otherwise, everyone's expected to work. And this is enforced in a very practical way because for the vast majority of people, if you don't work, you don't get any money, you don't have an income, and therefore you are completely denied access to goods and services. Now, it's true that if this policy were imposed strictly, in the strictest way possible, then we'd have huge social problem, because there's simply, even now, there are not enough jobs to go around. We're not even talking about meaningful jobs, we're just talking about any kind of remunerative position. They're not enough, and so some people have to go on welfare, some people end up on employment insurance, and those are recognitions on the part of the existing system that something, even now, something has to be done to help those who fall through the cracks, who cannot find employment through no fault of their own. So even though there's this expectation that everyone should work, there's also this acknowledgement that we don't have enough work for everyone to do, even now, even with all the
Hmm.
artificial growth and artificial activity and waste in the system. We still don't provide people with enough offers of employment to completely saturate the demand for employment. And that is, of course, only going to intensify as technology continues to advance and we automate more and more tasks, and people are thrown out of work. Right?
Yeah.
Now, we say from a social credit perspective, this actually is a wonderful thing. That it's good. It's authentic, a sign of authentic economic progress for us to be able to provide the goods and services people need with fewer and fewer people actually employed. And the only thing, though, is that we do have to find some way of altering the financial system and altering the rules of the game so that those people who are not required by the economic system can nevertheless be given an income, which would be in the form of a national dividend, and thereby retain access to the goods and services that they need to survive and flourish, and also maintain the demand on the part of consumers for industry's goods. All right, so that's sort of a very general, I mean, we'll look at some of these things in greater detail in a moment, but that's a very sort of general social credit attitude and approach to this question of employment. Now, is there anything that you wanted to add to that before we start pulling this apart a little bit?
Well, I'll just say that when you come to realize, or you see just how, say, obsolete the policy of full employment is becoming, and then how unsustainable it is when you've got machines doing more and more of the work, and thus requiring less and less human labor. So thus there's not enough, as you say, there's not enough jobs, paid positions to go around for everyone, at least not permanent full-time positions. So you just really wonder how supposedly educated, advanced, developed first world country, or first world countries in general, how they can continue to enforce that's both sides of the political spectrum of the politics, continue to dogmatically enforce the policy of full employment when it is becoming no longer sustainable and no longer necessary, and all it is doing is imposing misery and serious damage, social, psychological, familial, even physical and environmental damage upon society with the continued imposition of this policy of full employment.
Right.
Because in order to maintain this, you have the government will create jobs, or government or the private sector will create jobs just for the sake of creating jobs in order to keep people employed, not because those jobs are actually necessary from a physical production perspective.
Right. So that's really what it comes down to. Economics is supposed to be about efficiency. It's supposed to be about getting the goods and services we need with the least amount of labor and the least amount of resource consumption. And if we actually had a physically efficient economy, an economy that was efficient in this physical sense, then instead of an anachronistic policy of full employment, we would have the policy of the minimum employment necessary. That is to say that, in approaching this question of employment, like I was saying earlier, we'd simply ask ourselves, how many people do we really need working in the formal economy, in paid employment, to produce the goods and services that we need to survive and flourish. The goods and services that we would choose if we were independent consumers and not sort of forced by circumstances to consume things that we otherwise wouldn't select for ourselves. And yes, I think the answer to that question is that it's a minority. It's less than half, and it's also something that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller as time goes on. You see, so
yes.
In 100 years' time, what will the situation be? Some people say that by 2060, virtually all jobs will or at least could be automated.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So from a social credit point of view, we have no problem with that in theory. I'm not saying that all jobs should be automated. It's a question of whether machines can do those jobs as well as humans can. There might be certain things that we prefer for humans to do because they do a better job of it. But yes, it's a serious problem. I mean, from our point of view, employment is not the end. It's not the purpose of the economy. The economy does not exist to provide people with employment. It exists to provide people with the goods and services that they need to survive and flourish. And so if that objective can be obtained with no one working, it's largely irrelevant. Okay?
That's right.
Work is a means to another distinct end. It is not an end in itself.
That's right. So we work to live. We don't live to work.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, and grant that, as you said, I think that they're always as far as automation goes, and just how far it will go. I think there'll always be a certain degree of demand or need for human labor in certain areas, certain professions and services and so forth. Like say in the medical field, doctors, nurses, or in the even in the sales field, people want in a lot of areas where humans need personal service,
human contact.
Yeah, so perhaps like sales representatives, shop clerks, in even domestic service, for instance, people who desire house staff and things like that. People want or desire a lot of people would prefer to be served or assisted by a human than a machine. So in those areas, I think that there's still a need for human labor. But other than that, most of the jobs that are done to provide are done. Most of the jobs that produce are just designed to produce goods and services but don't require so much human contact, are most likely to be automated or could be automated. So if we were to abolish the policy of full employment, it would open the door to automating all these jobs. So if we don't, we don't need, people don't have to be employed. They're just getting a dividend. We just rather than them having them do these menial jobs that perhaps they probably quite often wouldn't enjoy. They just do it because they have to attain purchasing power to live. We could automate them, and so that those people could then be doing better things with their time, be pursuing crafts, hobbies, the arts, or personal service, or charity, or voluntary work, with or
scientific research.
They're doing things that that they're most disposed to and the most interested and the most passionate about, and not just because they need to do it to attain purchasing power in order to live.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So right there, you've touched on something that often comes up when we talk about replacing a policy of full employment with a policy of the minimum employment necessary, and that is, oh well, if you do that, and most people are unemployed, don't have a paid position in the formal economy, what are all these people going to do? This is always the big worry. And our answer to that, of course, is, well, leisure is a great good. Leisure meaning the state in which you are economically free and independent to choose for yourself how to meaningfully spend your time, right? For some strange reason, when we talk about leisure, when social creditors talk about leisure, some people assume that we're talking about idleness or things that you do on a vacation. That's leisure. But that's not the original meaning of the term, and it's not what we intend.
Yeah.
Right? So there are all sorts of meaningful things that people can do outside of the formal economy. Would it require sort of changing the culture to facilitate this and to support this? Would it require making alterations in the educational system so that instead of preparing people to follow orders, we prepare people for a life of leisure? Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But those changes can be made, and we should point out to those who think that the sky will fall, who are sort of puritanical in their sensibilities, there were times in European history where the general populace enjoyed a lot more leisure time than they do right now in our so-called advanced societies. And the sky didn't fall. In medieval England, they enjoyed 150 holidays per year, and the average peasant apparently only had to work 15 weeks of the year to provide for himself and his family. So there have been times in the past, and there are even times now in certain countries of the world, where people do enjoy a lot of free time. And that was, of course, how the great European cathedrals were built, and how much of the arts and sciences had room to grow and flourish in the Middle Ages, ironically laying the foundation for our modern world, because people had free time.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Oliver, and that's right. But now it seems, all the great technological, scientific, and artistic wealth and prosperity and technology that's been brought to us via people of leisure, we the people today living today must be continue to be, or even more so, subject to this policy of full employment, where you must work, at least in the formal paid economy, in order to get your keep. And leisure is pretty real leisure is pretty well discouraged and considered anathema even by some. It's quite ironic, and it's really quite insidious.
Yeah.
So,
one thing I was going to add as well is that people may not have a clear idea as to how the financing would be done. As we've talked before when discussing national dividend, we're not conventional basic income supporters, so we're not suggesting that the people that still have a job will be taxed more and more to support the growing numbers of unemployed, and we're not in favor of ramping up the public debt ad nauseum in order to fund the national dividend. The national dividend is funded through the creation of debt-free credit made possible by monetary reform, changing the rules of the monetary system. And what's interesting is that the same phenomenon which, on a physical level, is responsible for throwing people out of work, and is responsible for, this threat of 50% of American jobs being automated in the next 20 years. That is to say, real capital, the development of technology and technique. this phenomenon is also generating on a financial plane an increasing gap between the rate at which costs and hence prices are generated in the economy and the rate at which incomes are simultaneously being distributed to consumers in the form of wages, salaries, and dividends. So by monetizing that gap with debt-free credit and distributing it to people as a dividend, independently of employment status, we are in fact killing two birds with one stone. We're addressing the physical problem, which is also a financial problem, the fact that more and more people are going to be without employment. And at the same time, we're addressing this chronic deficiency of consumer buying power, which is intensified by the replacement of labor with real capital. So it's actually quite elegant, the social credit solution. And seeing that it's very difficult to understand how you could adequately finance a conventional basic income using orthodox means of taxation if more and more people are going to be without employment, or just ramping up the debt, which of course has to be repaid in taxation. It's very difficult to understand how those financial methods could be sustainable. And so it may be that the one thing that social credit has going for it more than any other factor is this increasing automation and what it threatens to do to established patterns of employment.
Yes, that's right. It could very well end up forcing the issue as automation continues, unless somehow those in power of high finance and politics try to stop the automation or delay it or prevent it from going any further. It could very well end up forcing the issue as more people are left technologically unemployed. They're going to be forced to ask the question, what do people do now, and how do people get an income outside of work if they don't have work, have a formal job a paid job in the formal economy?
Yes, and unless we make these sort of social credit adjustments, it's very difficult to understand how the standard of living can be maintained, a standard of living that people have come to expect in developed economies. So, it seems that social credit not only is a way out, but it's really the only way of resolving a lot of these problems in a way that's not going to require the general population to, get used to living under pre-industrial conditions where they only get crumbs.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, it's just a question of how long are people going to accept that, at least in mass numbers of people. Going to accept living on crumbs when they can see the writing on the wall, where we have all this technology and all that's producing all these goods and services with so few people required, that is enough for everyone or all the population. So why are we living worse? In worse conditions now than we were, say, 50 years ago.
That's right.
Yeah. And just another, I would consider utterly insane aspect of this, and really wicked aspect of this policy of full employment, is that 50 years ago, they started the politics and certain social movements, as well as politicians, as well, and high finance who have backed it politically and financially. That is the policy of forcing both, in families, forcing both the mother and father into the workforce. So forcing the mothers into the workforce, whereas though traditionally it was the mother the father would go out to work to provide, and the mother would stay home to raise the children at home. Now, just 50 years ago, those in power decided to abolish that state of affairs and force the mothers into the workforce as well. So now they're trying to impose two-income families on the population. So expecting both parents to be gainfully employed, and this is that, and that came right at a time when technological automation was really kicking off. So why on earth do they insist not only keep full employment for all men, but now full employment for all women?
Right.
Why do they insist on this insane policy? I mean, it's been that policy, this two-income policy, it's been enormously destructive towards the family structure. It's exploded the cost of living, the cost of homes, purchasing homes and goods and services.
And it's had that effect on homes, because the banks, seeing that people are earning more money, they're able to lend more money to people to buy homes, which of course they create out of nothing. So they're in a position to lend more money, and then people are bidding up the prices of housing values. And as a result, real estate goes through the roof, and the woman, let's say, whatever earnings she might make, a large proportion of it is going to be going to the mortgage, to the increased mortgage that they'll have to pay, and whatever other costs she has associated with work, like another car, work clothes, daycare, TV dinners, what have you, expensive vacations to sort of compensate for the stress and so forth. So it is very insidious from several points of view, really.
Yeah, no, that's right, exactly. Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it costs money to go to work too. That, as you said, cars, uniforms, work lunches, and of course, if both spouses are working, they're not going to have much time for home cooking or any kind of homemade goods. So they're going to be eating out more. They're going to be buying more things from third-party providers, and then of course outsourcing. And this is really extreme injustice towards the newer generations of children today. Their raising and care is being outsourced to third-party commercial providers. So that's daycare facilities.
That's right. Yeah.
So as much as, say, daycare workers may have the best intentions for the children in mind, one
would hope.
One would hope anyway. The children are forcefully separated from their mothers, from their parents, into third-party carers where they, often with often 20 other children. So thus their amount of care and attention is severely limited. So it's extremely cruel and unjust towards both parents and children.
Yes.
But in a situation like that, there's no time for leisure. There's no time for love or family or relationships.
Yes, I worked once for a daycare center. Well, I was actually working at a day camp, a summer camp that was organized out of this daycare center. But a lot of those kids would have been daycare kids in their earlier years, and some of those kids, they tell me that their parents would drop them off at 7 a.m. and pick them up at 6 p.m. or even later at night. and they'd go home, have dinner, have a bath, go straight to bed, and do it all over again the next day. So when you talk about those sorts of conditions, the social effect of that and the cultural effect of that, and I mean, what's the connection between that and things like delinquency and drug and alcohol
Exactly.
addiction and psychological and emotional problems and mental health issues and so on and so forth? I mean, of course, that all creates jobs and economic growth and all sorts of industries to deal with all that fallout. Um, but the human cost is really immense and so unnecessary when, as we've
Yes.
been saying, we survived quite well on a physical level in the 50s with only having the men work, or mainly having the men work, at a much lower level of technology. Now, when that technology is much further advanced, we should be having even fewer people
That's
required
right.
to work in the formal economy. We should
So
all be enjoying the balance in increased leisure.
absolutely, and so now even the men should be let alone the women, should be
That's right.
working less. And there's also a fact that we hear a lot about how the women were encouraged, expected, or forced to go out into the workforce in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so forth, by the various political, social, and financial interests. It's also what a lot of people today don't know or don't realize is that even once upon a time, especially in pre-industrial times, most of the men did not leave the home or its immediate vicinity to go out to work. They worked from home. So they worked on their farms, or they had shops. They had shop fronts, and they lived behind the shop or whichever. So even the fathers were still remained close to their families and their children, even though they worked. So then came the Industrial Revolution. Well, perhaps that brought great technological innovation that then also forced the fathers to leave the home for most of the week to go out to work in the factories or the offices or whichever. So that was really where it started, the disintegration of family life and the marriage and child rearing and all the rest of it. The fathers were separated from their wives and children in the in the Industrial Revolution, and then 100 years later, in the late 20th century, then the mothers forced out of the home and into the workforce, or encouraged to go out of the work and into the workforce. So the children have lost both their parents, which has further destroyed the family life and structure.
That's right. And so if people had a national dividend, if we had a social credit monetary system, and people enjoyed a national dividend, and we finally jettisoned this policy of full employment and replaced it with a more rational policy where we only employ as many people as are actually needed to get the job done. What effects would that have then for this situation that you're describing with mothers and fathers and families?
Well, it would mean that families can be whole again. They can be together again. So you have not just the mothers, but also the fathers. The mothers would not have to work, and the fathers would not have to work, at least not as much. Say 2 or 3 days a week, as much as 4 days a week. And the rest of the time of the week they can have with their families, with their children and their wives, to develop and cultivate the relationships with their wives and children.
Right.
So you won't result in frayed relationships or family or marriage breakdowns or deprived or dysfunctional children who end up with all sorts of psychological, mental issues and substance addictions and delinquency and all the rest of it. Because the parents are with their children far more often in order to rear them and to guide them, so that they won't end up going off the rails as they often are these days.
Right. Okay. Yes. So, yeah, I think that's basically it in a nutshell. I think we've said most of what we intended to say. So the takeaway is, if we lived in a rational system, what is physically sensible should be what guides us. What's physically necessary for an economy to function is what should guide us, not the financial system. The financial system should simply mirror or make possible what is physically possible. And if it is physically possible for us to provide everything we need with only a small and ever diminishing portion of the available labor force actually working, then the economic system should accommodate that, and that should be the policy we have in place, one of the minimum employment needed, that is efficiency. And to insist on anything other than that, to insist on full employment, or as some of the MMT people, the modern monetary theory people, insist on a policy of, a job guarantee where the government would become sort of the job provider of last resort, that is not simply inefficient, it's highly inefficient and therefore irrational. It is also a policy of slavery, of servitude.
That's right.
Where you're requiring more from people, more of their time and energy than is actually physically necessary for the economy to achieve its end. And that is an infringement on legitimate freedoms which no authentically free society should ever tolerate. But we tolerate it now. And it's, as we've been talking about, it's got worse, because at one point it didn't apply to the women, but now it applies to the women, and it was sold to them under the name of liberation, of emancipation. So it's all very ironic. But yeah, any policy that requires more employment from the people than is actually physically needed for the economy to fulfill its objective, that is a policy of slavery, of servitude.
Yeah. Servile worker state.
The servile worker state. So social credit stands against the servile worker state. It stands against full employment because full employment is not needed at our current level of technology. And it stands for increasing leisure.
That's right.
Not
exactly.
Not just because, but because the technological developments that we enjoy permit and allow for us to have the possibility of enjoying greater leisure. So there's a physical basis for it. This isn't pie in the sky. This is something that is physically possible.
Absolutely.
And if finance reflected the physical reality accurately, what is physically possible would become the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the opportunity is there. We only have the choice to seek upon it.
Yes. All right. So I think we'll leave it there, and we will talk again next week on another subject. If anyone has any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments section. Please subscribe, and I will also add to this video an article that I wrote on socred.org, which is the website of the Clifford Hugh Douglas Institute for the Study and Promotion of Social Credit. And that article is entitled "The Folly of Full Employment." So it sort of goes through some of the points that we've been discussing tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you for your attention, and have a good day, Michael.
Yes, you too, Oliver.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.